Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, which belongs to the Professional Development Webinar Series organized by the Regional Studies Association. Today, our speaker is Marcin Dąbrowski on the topic Writing Skills, Writing Your First Academic Article. My name is Sabrina. I'm an assistant professor in special planning at the University of Cagliari in Italy, and I have the great pleasure to chair this event. Before giving the floor to Marcin, let me say a few words about the Regional Studies Association, which is the global and interdisciplinary network for urban and regional research, development, and policy. The Regional Studies Association supports its members in a number of different ways, comprising latest research, funding schemes, networking and publishing opportunities, and also spaces to grow research and careers. As a response to the current global crisis, the RSA board put in place initiatives to support its members and the wider communities, such as this series, which is the Professional Development Webinar Series that offers sessions on academic publishing, networking skills, and career development. Then there's another series that is the Regions, Cities, Industry Webinar Series, which delivers monthly sessions by experts in the field of regional studies, science, planning, and policy. And also a small grant schemes on pandemics, cities, regions, and industry, which was launched this summer to promote and encourage research and dissemination activities on how regions, cities, and industry are addressing the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemics. More details on these new initiatives can be found on the RSA website, so I warmly invite you to have a look at the website where you will find more information and details. The Regional Studies Association also has a new app which will be published shortly and will enable you to network and attend virtual events. Now, moving on to some general information about the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and it will be available for RSA members on the RSA Members Lounge. For any questions you might want to ask Marcin, please use the Q&A function in the menu at the bottom of your screen. You can write your questions during the talk, and at the end, we will have a Q&A session. Finally, let me please introduce our speaker. Marcin Dąbrowski is currently an assistant professor at the Department of Urbanism at the Faculty of Architecture and the Built Environment at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. His research interests focus on governance of territory, including regional strategies for circular economy, governance of urban climate change adaptation policy, Europeanization of spatial planning. He is also the co-organizer of the Regional Studies Association Research Network on EU cohesion policy. And on this topic, he has published extensively. Last but not least, which brings us to the topic of this webinar, he is also the lead editor of the Early Career section of Regional Studies, Regional Science, the RSA Open Access Journal that offers a special mentor route designed for early career researchers. So, building on this role and on his experience, Marcin can offer excellent advice to PhD students and early careers on how to approach their first independent academic article. I would now like to hand over to Marcin. So Marcin, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sabrina, for the introduction. Also, thank you very much for the Regional Studies Association for having me as a speaker for this webinar. It's a great pleasure. And thank you all to all the participants for joining us. I see already in the chat that you come from a variety of places, which is great. So I think Sabrina said a lot already about what we're going to talk about today, a lot about me, so I can be brief and just dive right into this and our today's topic about writing your first academic paper. Here is the outline of my presentation for today. Will be divided in three parts. First, we'll discuss how to start, how to actually prepare yourself and prepare the work on the paper. Then in the second part, we will discuss, well, a formula for an academic paper. We'll discuss whether there is one at all. And finally, I will give you a series of tips for succeeding in academic writing, which hopefully you will find useful in this. So without further ado, let's begin with the first part, how to start. So first, before you begin writing, actually, you have to ask yourself a set of very important questions. Preferably note down the answers and then also plan a bit. So here are those questions. First of them would be about the relevance of your research. What makes my research relevant at all? Why should anyone bother reading this? And it may sound obvious, but I think it's really important to think that through very thoroughly. And also try to think about the research puzzle, the problem that others have been grappling with, that your research and your paper could actually address. Then you have to ask yourself also what sort of previous knowledge you are going to build on, what sort of literature, empirical studies, theory, and so on. And very importantly, you have to understand yourself first, what is the gap in that knowledge? What are the remaining unanswered questions that you could tackle in your paper? So in other words, you need to contextualize and position your work within the existing scholarship. So without that, the paper, I'm afraid, will not have much interest. And then another question, equally important, what is new and original about my work? What are the original elements that I will bring to the debate with my paper? So you must ask yourself, what does it actually mean, new and original? And there's various ways of bringing in originality. So for example, you can bring a new take on theory, you can propose a new method or new methodology to tackle a certain problem or to research a certain issue. You may bring in new empirical evidence using existing theories and methods, or you may maybe bring in a new research topic, a new research phenomenon to study that others have not necessarily been looking at. And here, an important message that I wanted to convey also is that doesn't mean that you have to really reinvent the wheel or propose a major theoretical revolution of sorts. What is important is to specify that contribution and understand it more as a little piece of the puzzle, of a much larger puzzle. So scientific research is more about adding a small brick to the larger edifice of knowledge. So I think it's important to bear this in mind. Next set of questions concerns your audience and your message to that audience. So who am I writing for? And that's really an important step that sometimes gets forgotten. Are you writing for your fellow academics? In what discipline actually? Or perhaps are you writing for practitioners? And importantly, what will be the key takeaway message for that audience or those different types of audience? And after you answer those questions, you need to do some planning. Planning the work on the paper, which does take a lot of time. We also tend to underestimate that amount of time that is needed for writing an academic paper. The second question would be about possible help. Who can help you write the paper? Perhaps there are some co-authors you could work with. Perhaps your mentor or your supervisor could also help you write it, or someone more experienced. And once you establish that, another thing to do critically before you begin really writing the paper is to plan its structure, outline the key sections of the paper, the key points you're going to make in each of them in bullet points. And also I would advise you also to set targets for the length of each of the sections, not to kind of overrun, not to go over the word limit, which often happens. And if you have co-authors, then you may also think of a division of labor between the authors on those different sections of the paper. Okay, so this is about how to start. Now, how do you actually do it? How do you structure the paper? And the question is there a formula? And you may understand this very well already, having read many academic papers, that there's a great variety of approaches and of paper structures, of writing styles, and so on. So there's really no fixed format. But yes, there is a certain convention perhaps. And this convention matters because it facilitates understanding and facilitates dialogue in the academic community. In a nutshell, I think that every paper should do something like this, right? It should first set the context for the study and help the reader understand, why was I told this? Why does it matter for me? Then comes your content, so your theory, your methods, your empirical material. And then you have to discuss your findings and conclude and explain to the reader, so why does it actually matter? And paradoxically, often those two first elements, first and last, so the context setting and the concluding, are perhaps more important than your content to write a good paper. And then bear in mind also this. So a red line that you should try to follow throughout your paper so that the reader doesn't get lost and that you follow a coherent line of argument and stay focused. Another thing to consider also when thinking about structure of a paper is this, right? So an hourglass as a metaphor for structure of the paper as well, and the degree to which it should be broad or focused. So basically, you begin always with an abstract, really, which should be your paper compressed in a pill format. But then comes the introduction to a paper. And again, as I said, this is just one of the possible structures that you can go for, but it's a typical one as well, and the one that you will encounter the most often. So basically, the introduction should start broad, contextualize position, attract the attention of the reader, but then you narrow down. When you go to the literature review and you build your theoretical background and your theoretical framework, then you narrow down the focus as well. You narrow it further with methodology, explaining how your particular research has been done. And then it's even further towards the middle of the hourglass, so even narrower in focus when you discuss your specific results. And then after this, you open up again the discussion to broaden the perspective again, and also the same in the conclusion. So simplifying, these are the roles, the functions of those different sections. So first, well, you define your entire paper in a nutshell in the abstract, then you set the scene and grab attention in the introduction. Then you position, frame your research in existing scholarship, in existing theories, and then you define your approach, both in terms of theory and then methods. You present your key results, so that's the most concrete part, and then you open up again. In the discussion, you explain, so what is the meaning of those findings, relating that to the existing literature, and then finally, in conclusion, you sum up and explain what is the takeaway message, and critically, for whom is that message, and what next, what should be the policy recommendations from that, what should be further research that could be done on the basis of the brick you added to the big edifice of knowledge that I mentioned before. Okay, so how do we actually succeed? So what we'll follow now is a set of tips, really. I think you could have many, many more tips, but I decided to limit myself to a few of those that I think are the most important. And the first one is that first impressions matter. So basically, you need a catchy and informative title for your paper to attract attention and so for the readers to see it. And also, this relates to the abstract, which has to be also engaging and explaining very well what your research is about and why it matters. Why should anyone be interested in reading this? So if you look at any of the good journals, you look at the most cited papers, the most read papers, have a look at how those titles are structured. So very often they are rather short, but very informative and catchy. The second tip I would give you is that less is more, at least most of the time. And what I mean here is that in order to write a good paper, you need to select a piece of your research. So typically we research a lot of things. We look at various research questions. If it's a PhD research, then it can be really huge. So it really matters not to try to cram everything into a paper, which is limited in length, right? Typically it's about 7,000 or 8,000 words, sometimes shorter. And you have to focus on the core message. So select a chunk that really matters from that research and put it in your paper. Don't put too much. The third tip would be about being strategic in the choice of the journal, and then being strategic also in tailoring the content of the paper for it. So you have to, well, a good tip that, that could be related to that is to choose a journal which appears the most often in your reference list, right? But you can also work the other way. Think of a journal that you would really like to publish in, and then make sure you do include on your reference list papers from that journal. And do that because then you can show that you add to a debate, ongoing debate in that particular journal. And that way you can sell your paper better in a cover letter to the editors, and they typically like that. Finally, try to also look at the style of the papers published in the journal you are interested in and try to mimic it, try to fit. So the important thing here, the bottom line, is really to try to have the editors of the journal on your side. Sometimes they can also help you in struggles with the reviewers. The fourth tip would be to embrace criticism, and that's maybe a bit paradoxical, maybe a bit controversial, but basically, yeah, just be happy about getting critical comments. And also bear in mind that rejection happens to everyone. So I've seen, being an editor for several special issues, for example, I've seen rejections happening to really top scholars, also to high-level professors. Sometimes this would come as a surprise, but bottom line is it happens to everyone. So my message to you here would be that what doesn't kill you makes you a better writer. So embrace the critique you got and just try to build on it to refine your paper and write a better paper in the end. And if you're really frustrated with that, a bonus tip I would give you is to look into some academic humor on the internet, which really helps you vent some of the frustration. This is just one of the examples from Shit My Reviewers Say, Tumblr blog and Twitter account. So you can find a lot of humor also in sometimes crude and cruel reviews that you may get. Okay, number 5, cut the jargon, write plainly. Be simple, be clear. This is really, really important. Keep it simple, keep it concise, and keep it clear. Again, to make your reader, your reviewer, and your editor happy, right? Avoid flowery language, and also particularly if you're not a native speaker like myself in English, try to avoid metaphors also, because often the meaning of those metaphors can get lost in translation. So really clarity, clarity, clarity. Point number 6, and tip number 6 I would give you is not to force the reviewers to search for your arguments. So make sure that your arguments are not buried there under a pile of other arguments, anecdotes, and so on. Again, this is intended to make the reviewers and the editors happy. Make sure you flag up the key points and make sure that those points are crystal clear. Because you cannot assume that the value of your paper, the novelty of your arguments will be obvious. You have to really explain that and try to sell it also. Tip number 7, follow the conventions. So as boring as it sounds, but really please do. Please read the instructions for offers. They're also there to help you. And this matters particularly for referencing. And again, is part of making the editors and reviewers happy and not giving them any reasons to dislike your paper for such reasons. Tip number 8 would be to focus on conveying knowledge that can actually be useful to others. So the point is probably obvious, isn't it? But I have a feeling that quite often gets forgotten. And it could relate to one of the previous tips also that I gave you, to focus on the really important messages. And another thing to consider would be to make that message useful to others, whether it's a new method, whether it's a piece of information on a relevant and salient issue. Just make sure that it's clear why people would want to read this. And don't assume that the readers would understand immediately the importance and usefulness of your research. Tip number 9, you can disagree with the reviewers. They are very important, and you have to be able to reply to the comments in an exhaustive way and respectful way, also to the reviewers that tend to be nasty. But you can disagree as long as you explain why and you justify your choices. So I think that in that case, editors can be on your side too. And tip number 10 would be to aim high. And why? Because you can do it. So quite often I see that early career researchers they tend to start with journals that are lower in the pecking order, assuming maybe it will be easier. And yeah, maybe it will be easier. But also what you have to consider that in a journal that is not so good, maybe the quality of the review will not be as good, and therefore you will not benefit from it. So my point here would be that if your research is original, if it fits the scope of the journal, if it's ticking all the boxes that I mentioned about originality, about clarity, structure, and so on, just go ahead and go for a good journal, and perhaps it will work. So I know several people who have published papers based on their master thesis in leading journals. So it's not impossible, and I would encourage you to do it. And finally, an extra tip, really, to close the whole talk would be that you are not alone. And it's important to bear in mind that we are a community of scholars. We work in a community as well. And dialogue and feedback is part of the culture of that community. So it's important to reach out to those assets and ask for feedback. Ask your colleagues, ask your supervisors, ask your mentors. Find mentors, find possible co-authors that you can write with and learn from. And perhaps a good tip for that as well, in case you have not yet seen this, is to consider also submitting your paper proposal to the early career papers section of Regional Studies, Regional Science, which is the RSA's open access journal. And it's quite a unique opportunity to get this kind of precious feedback from an experienced editor before your paper is sent for external peer review. So do have a look. The next deadline for submissions is the end of this month. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found those comments useful, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions and comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Marcin. And I see we have already a couple of questions here. Apology in advance to all of the attendees because I will for sure mispronounce your names, so don't be offended by that. A first question is by Aya Badawi, who asks how to know the type of audience when writing a paper. Does it depend on the discipline of the journal? You mentioned that when you write an article, you have to have in mind who are you writing for. But how do you know that?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Aya, for that question. I think it's a good one. And maybe I can give you two elements of response to that question. Well, first would be, well, it does relate to the discipline that predominates in a given journal. So quite often we do research that is on the boundary between different disciplines or builds on several different disciplines. And then you may have a choice. Do I submit it to, for example, a journal focusing on geography, or perhaps on spatial and urban planning, or perhaps is it a topic for a political science journal? So these are the kind of questions that you have to ask yourself, particularly if your research spans the boundary between several disciplines. And then also you may decide who your audience is, depending whether you want to address an academic audience or a practitioner's audience. And in those cases, you will have to use a different kind of language, different emphasis on theory, for example, as opposed to emphasis on practical policy relevant issues.
We have also a couple of questions about the journals. You suggested aiming high, but Bozidar Ivanov has a question saying that they identify a journal which is about a bit outside the ones that he or she usually reads, but the call for papers provides an interesting theoretical framework. So would it be wise to submit in such a context?
Well, I think that it's hard to answer in that particular case. It could be a good idea if you would then contribute to a special issue, for example, because then your paper ends up being part of a bunch of interrelated papers that are bundled by editorial introduction, sometimes also a concluding article. And that definitely helps to engage in dialogue with others and helps with visibility of your work. But the question that only you can answer is it the kind of visibility that you want, depending on your career goals, this discipline you're working in, and so on.
And there's also another question about the issue of selecting the most appropriate journal, which is what if a research topic fits the scope of a journal, but is not addressed by recent publication in that journal by Pasquale Pizzimenti.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. It's also a good tip. And again, it's hard to give you kind of a clear guidance there because it all depends on the situation. But I think that it could be interesting to also bring a new issue to the attention of the journal. It may be difficult though to do, but it's worth trying as long as you then see potential for that issue the topic that you're working on to spark interest of the readers of the journal. So then here a good idea would be to really be very smart about tailoring your cover letter, explaining to the editor why they should bother and why this issue is really new perhaps, but interesting for the journal to consider.
And still on the topic of selecting the right journal, which has stimulated a lot of questions, Tom Arnold asks, at what point you decide which journals you plan to submit to? So is it when you're writing, before writing, or when?
Yes, thanks, Tom. That's also a nice question. And again, I think that may depend on your approach, but I would suggest to consider that early on. So when you begin to kind of answer those questions that I outlined in the first part of the presentation, and that is because then you can tailor the paper already to that particular journal. And the more you make it fit in the journal's scope, the more you make it resonate and engage in dialogue with the papers in that journal, I think that the better the chance of acceptance. So do that early on, but nothing prevents you from changing your decision later as well. And also, frankly, as I said, rejection happens to everyone, and it happens quite often. So also it may well be the case that your dream journal, your target journal, rejects your paper, and then you have to try another one, and then do this process again of tailoring the paper to that particular journal.
And two more questions, and I think the last one about choosing a journal, whether it's better to submit a paper on an open access journal, and by I5U, whether we should make decision based on the ranking of the journal, so low opportunities because the ranking is high, and seeing higher potential in a lower ranked journal.
Okay, thank you very much for those two questions. So answering the first one about open access, right? Is it a good idea, always a good idea to submit to open access? So I think that, well, in the last few years, the landscape in academic publishing has been changing dramatically towards open access format. It's increasingly becoming a standard, particularly in Europe, where a lot of funding agencies require you to publish in open access. So yeah, it is becoming a must. But on the other hand, also it's important to stress that it has a number of advantages in terms of exposure and readership of your paper. So simply put, it broadens the range of your readers and makes your work accessible to all those readers who would normally not have access to academic journals that are behind a paywall, so that are not based at universities that pay the subscriptions for those journals. So if you're after a broad audience in particular, then I think open access is really the way forward. And it makes it easier to diffuse then the findings of your research. And the second question was from Cinco, I guess, about whether to choose
the higher ranked journals because they have higher potentials, lower potential.
Yeah, so whether it's a good idea to for example, aim for a journal that has less impact in order to have a higher chance of acceptance. Yeah. So again, this is something that you have to weigh carefully. And it's always a good idea to ask your peers or mentors, more senior colleagues for feedback on this, whether this paper is a potential fit for the journal. Is it good enough? But at the same time, I would, as I said in the presentation, if you aim for a good journal from the start, then you set the bar high and you aim towards that bar. You can try to get feedback from others to reach that level. And the risk when you go for a low quality journal is that the paper will be less read if it's accepted. It will matter slightly less than in a good journal. And also, I think what I experienced and observed is that in lower quality journals, not always, but sometimes you do get lower quality reviews. And that's bad for you as a writer because you don't get the critical feedback that you need to improve the paper and bring its standard higher.
Which brings in another question that was raised about how to select the journal. So how to recognize the predatory journal, for instance, where the quality is low, the reviewer are also generally low.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks for this question. I think that, well, as a general rule, I think that good journalists won't necessarily approach you to submit papers to them, right? That's one kind of red lamp that should light up when you get emails, please submit a paper to us. It's not a good sign. If a journal is good, then you will want to submit your paper there. So that's the first thing. And then there are also, there are lists, there are registers of respected journals. So for example, for the open access journals, there is a directory of open access journals, which lists all the high quality journals that open access and excludes the predatory ones. So this is a good way to start. But really, I would advise you to begin with your reference list, right? So when you do research, you begin, you all do literature review, you read things, just have a look at where do the authors you cite publish. That's usually a good place to start.
Now, moving on from the selection of the journal to the reviews, a very popular question by Liu Cao is how to handle reviewers' comments. Sometimes the comments are actually not helpful, and also they might have misunderstood your message.
So what can I say? Reviewers are also people. They also make mistakes. They often are in a hurry. And yeah, we all have weaknesses. So not all reviews are of good quality. So again, a good journal will also make sure to select reviewers that can deliver a high quality review, but there may be misunderstandings also. There may be sometimes also, you may experience a bit of power play or desire, for example, for certain authors to cite, certain reviewers, sorry, to look at their own papers. So you get this kind of behavior sometimes, but how to handle this, I would just advise you to really stay calm. And even if you find a review hurtful or that it's very critical, just try to compose yourself and answer in a very diplomatic way and as exhaustively as you can and respectfully. There's no point really in entering in a heated argument with a reviewer. This won't get you anywhere. So you need to answer to all the comments. And if you disagree, if you think that the reviewer have maybe misunderstood something, then try to explain that the key point again in a respectful and very clear way. And that way, perhaps, again, you will convince the editor to be on your side rather than on that of the reviewer. And what you can also do sometimes, and this is a strategic tip, I'm sure that some people will disagree with me here, is that sometimes you get contradictory reviews. So when reviewer one being quite positive about the paper, seeing the value of it, reviewer two being a bit skeptical, but okay, I can maybe accept that, and reviewer three saying that the paper is really below the threshold for anything publishable, or is written at the level of a student's essay. Sometimes you get that. So what you can do then in such a situation, you can also play the reviewers against each other, or try to then stress that other reviewers apart from that one have not found a particular issue with your methodology or the point that you are getting a critique on.
Still on the reviewing part, there's a question from Mariana Senkis, who has had a very bad experience, I think. She asks whether it is okay if there is no feedback from reviewers after like a year.
Oh, I think that, yeah, if it's a year, then there must be a problem of some sort. But I think that you have to be patient in general. And that is because we are all increasingly busy with stuff. We do more and more things as academics. And there is less and less time to write, to read, to do reviews. So I know again from experience that as guest editor of special issues or as editor of regional studies, regional science, that sometimes it's really hard to find a suitable reviewer who will be available also at the time. So it does take time sometimes. Or a reviewer agrees to review a paper, but then doesn't respond for a long time. So, so then it can take a few months sometimes. You have to be patient. But I think if it's a year, then there is a problem. And if I were you, I would probably just gently ask the editors of the journal about what's going on, how is the progress in getting the reviews, and typically they will answer you and try to solve the problem if it happens.
We are running a bit late, but there are so many questions still there. I will add a couple of questions about contents. Ruth Lucas asks for tips on how you can sense how relevant an idea is for a paper. You have an idea and you want to know whether it is publishable.
Okay, yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question. I think that, well, the first thing I would try to do is to formulate a research question on that basis, right? What is the puzzle that is really tempting, intriguing, and worth solving? And if you can formulate such a research question, and if in addition you see that by answering it, you could address a certain gap in knowledge, a certain need for knowledge, for research on a particular topic, then typically it's a good idea to build a paper on. And maybe a small tip on this: have a look at the papers you work with for your literature review, and typically papers end with some suggestions for further research, unanswered questions, and with limitations of a certain research that was presented in the paper, which then suggests what other researchers can do. So if you can fit your research idea, your paper idea, into those gaps, into those calls for particular research on a particular topic, then typically there is a demand for this. So that would be a good idea to write a paper on.
And I think this will be the last question, still on content. So Eva Pulkar-Offer asks, what's your opinion on addressing shortcomings or limitation of the research in the paper? So whether it is better to be upfront about it, or whether it is better to wait for criticism from the reviewers and hope notice.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Eva. Also a nice question. And slightly difficult to answer because you have to be strategic here. Every research has biases and limitations. And I think part of the process of getting your paper published is identifying those weaknesses, and then thinking how can you compensate for them? How can you make sure that still, despite the weakness, what you come up with has value and adds something new to the discussion? So I would rather be upfront about most of the weaknesses, at least. Right. If there's smaller issues, you may be tempted to leave them. And anyway, the reviewers will pick up other points and will pick up most of the weaknesses that you see yourself. So it's probably best to just identify them up front and on the spot propose ways to mitigate those problems.
So we are 10 minutes late at the end of the webinar, so apologies to everybody who asked the question and we couldn't find the time to answer it. I would like to thank you all for participating in this webinar. Please do remember that this is a weekly series, so there will be another webinar next Wednesday. For more information on titles and speakers for each webinar, please have a look at the Regional Studies Association website. It's all for today. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks.